Hillary, I've got good news and bad news. The good news is Joe Biden has decided not to run against you. The bad news is that you testify at the Benghazi hearing tomorrow. Welcome to POTUS 2016. We are here each week calling the presidential horse race and inviting scholars to pour cold, hard facts on the overheated campaign rhetoric. Later on, we'll look at a couple of studies backing the assertion that global warming fuels violent conflicts around the globe, like in Syria. It's something candidate Bernie Sanders warns about. But first, yes, the horse race. In the White House Rose Garden, Vice President Joe Biden made the announcement he will not run.
But while I will not be a candidate, I will not be silent. I intend to speak out clearly and forcefully to influence as much as I can where we stand as a party and where we need to go as a nation.
And Biden urged voters not to reverse the Obama legacy, which he says has brought us from crisis to recovery and now resurgence. Biden had been weighing this for about 3 months, and shortly after his son Beau's death, surely a factor in the decision not to try for the presidency for a third time. Analysts have lately been saying that there wasn't much room for Biden in the race, what with Bernie Sanders' strong showings and after Clinton did well in the first debate. And indeed, Clinton's numbers are rising. According to the Morning Consult poll of registered voters taken from October 15th to 19th, Clinton in blue there dominates 56%. Bernie Sanders, appropriately in green, with less than half that support. 12% are undecided, more than the total for all other candidates combined. And a WBUR Boston poll shows Clinton now a few points ahead of Sanders, even in New Hampshire. We'll see if the Benghazi hearings affect any of her numbers. Meanwhile, on the GOP side, Donald Trump still on top at 40%. Ben Carson, 24%, Rubio, Bush, and Cruz around 5 or 6%, and again 12% undecided. Note that Trump has been in the lead for more than 90 days now. Are you starting to think maybe there could actually, possibly, conceivably be a President Trump? Polls clearly show GOP voters trust Trump most on the economy, but what about foreign policy? And should voters endorse Hillary Clinton, given her record as Secretary of State? Those are questions for our guests. Gideon Rose, editor of Foreign Affairs magazine and author of How Wars End, and Katrina Vanden Heuvel, editor and publisher of the Nation magazine and author of The Dictionary of Republicanisms, the indispensable guide to what they really mean when they say what they think you want to hear. Welcome, both of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Katrina, is the loss of Biden a loss for the discourse, a loss for the discourse on foreign policy, a loss for the richness of the Democratic debate, big D and small d, right now?
No, I think we saw in the Democratic debate last week a debate of ideas, not insults. We had a full spectrum. I think Bernie Sanders has widened the horizons, has brought issues into this debate which wouldn't otherwise have been there. Joe Biden, you know, the Hamlet walked off the stage. He's not with us, but he didn't add much in terms of policy issues, it seems to me, whether foreign policy or domestic. And he'll play a role, may come back in. He may come back in. It's not clear what will happen to Hillary Clinton's candidacy. It could still implode in ways we don't anticipate today.
So he's there as a backup candidate, Gideon.
An heir and a spare.
An heir and a spare.
Right. But do you agree that on foreign policy, not much is lost? If we look policy by policy, like how hawkish to be in Syria and a few other things, even TPP, the Pacific Rim trade deal, which he's now for and she's against, you know, they line up differently on some different things.
Yeah, but Obama, if he was going to back the Obama administration on foreign policy, we already have the Obama administration on foreign policy, so yet another spokesman for the Obama administration's foreign policy isn't going to add an extra.
You mean Hillary Clinton as past Secretary of State?
No, I mean Obama. In the sense that we already have the president and his spokesman and the Secretary of State making their case for foreign policy. Hillary trying to differentiate herself a little bit from that. It's not clear what Biden would add to that particular mix, which is already a slight dialogue between Obama and Hillary.
And I think you raise an important question, Brian. I think at the moment what we're witnessing in this election is a downsized politics of excluded alternatives. Even Bernie Sanders, with a few exceptions maybe on climate change, has not spoken forthrightly about a different policy than the Obama legacy. And I think that's a shame, because I think this, Gideon knows more about this than I do, but the disconnect between what goes on inside the Beltway and the rest of the country, I think the country's war-weary. I think it wants to be safe and secure but doesn't want to police the world. And I think you have armchair warriors who are always beating the drum and finding militaristic solutions to what are more manageable problems and don't demand that.
Which brings us to the Republican side of this debate, which is actually getting interesting on this issue. Donald Trump has basically said, let Putin handle this in Syria. Jeb Bush had an interesting response to the Donald's foreign policy statement on that. Asked by Charlie Rose on CBS if Trump's position would leave the country unsafe.
That's the point. He hasn't shared his views. When he talks about foreign policy, he talks about how Putin ought to go take care of ISIS. And the week before is ISIS ought to take care of Assad. He would send refugees back to Syria to their slaughter. I mean, these are serious times, and I think you need a person who has the temperament and the leadership skills to fix the things that are broken and do it with passion and conviction, but also have the skills to lead. And over the long haul, I think that's the lane I'm going to stay in, and I believe I'm going to be effective at doing it. I don't know about Donald Trump's views of leadership because he talks about himself the whole time.
So in response to Trump's position that Syria's just a quagmire, Putin's going to get bogged down there like we would have gotten bogged down there if we got more militarily involved. So with the lessons of Syria and Afghanistan, are the candidates, even on the GOP side, moving toward isolationism? Ted Cruz is certainly an advocate in that direction by now. This might surprise you that it's coming from someone as generally conservative and trying to look like a strong America candidate as Ted Cruz. Here he is on Meet the Press with Chuck Todd on Sunday.
Look, we have no business sticking our nose in that civil war. And there are a lot of politicians, including Hillary Clinton on the left, and including quite a few of the Republicans running for president on the right, who want us to get in the middle of that civil war.
So you're no on the no-fly zones, none of that stuff, stick to just ISIS. Would you work with the Russians? If they are helping with ISIS, would you help? Would you work with them?
We shouldn't be partnering with the Russians. Look, this.
And then there's Marco Rubio, who's positioning himself as more of an interventionist. In response to things like what we just heard from Ted Cruz, he was asked on Fox, Rubio was, maybe the Syrian civil war is none of our business.
They talk about attacking America in America. They talk about recruiting Americans to join their cause. They talk about how they're going to raise the black flag of ISIS over the White House and how they're going to attack Americans here in the homeland. They talk about how they're going to target servicemen and women in their homes and in their communities for killing and beheadings. They're not simply satisfied with controlling Afghanistan or Syria or Iraq. They want to conquer the world.
So, Katrina, are you surprised that candidates as prominent as Cruz and Trump are taking a kind of hands-off-the-Middle East approach?
We haven't even talked about Rand Paul, who has often been lifted up as an example of isolationism.
But he's all but dropped out.
Yeah, but I mean, his views have been part of the Republican Party mix, as they have been throughout history, more libertarian. I don't buy the isolationism. I think these, I can't speak for Ted Cruz, don't want to speak for Ted Cruz, but I think this is about a different engagement with the world. And again, I come back, Americans want to be safe, but they don't want to police the world. And in policing the world, I think we're detracting from some of the real security issues we should be concerned about. So, I think America needs to understand it's no longer the indispensable nation. There is triumphalism run amok. You heard Marco Rubio, who would find a military response to every problem, and that we need to be part of a more complex, multipolar world. And in that, the Republicans, many of them, are having problems. Donald Trump, I don't know, I want to hear Gideon, but the idea he's going to give China to Carl Icahn to run, for me, that kind of suggests he's not that serious. On the other hand, what he says about, let's leave this to Russia, it's a quagmire. They've seen it before, Russia has in Afghanistan. It's not the most foolish thing, though we have to play a role in the resolution.
Imagine if there is a Donald Trump, Hillary Clinton presidential campaign, she's the bigger hawk than the Republican.
Well, it's funny. Donald Trump has no filter. So he says whatever he thinks will be provocative or interesting or fun at that particular moment. And sometimes that's just wackiness and craziness that really doesn't deserve to be uttered. Sometimes it's what everybody is thinking, but no one says. He's the kid who points out the emperor has no clothes. So with Bush, for example, the idea that you could promote George W. Bush with the slogan, "He kept us safe," with a picture of a guy standing in the rubbles after we were attacked, was kind of madness. And Trump just pointed that out in a totally obvious way correctly, which is the picture doesn't go with the line, and neither of them go with the policies. Now, that's the idea that his immigration policies would have prevented 9/11 is silly, and a lot of, but so you have to take some things that Trump is saying as he's being right because he's just pointing out what everybody else won't say, and then, but not attribute to him a sophisticated theoretical perspective on the issues.
So he is very clever in what he's doing about George Bush. Jeb Bush, because he's enmeshing him in his brother's history and legacy, and if elections are about the future, which is the conventional wisdom, he's pushing him back to be ensnared in this past, which a lot of Americans want to move forward from.
Right.
Donald Trump is the greatest troll we've seen in presidential politics.
And is Jeb Bush his own man relative to George Bush? He says, yes, he's struggling so much. We're going to put up this Washington Post Venn diagram from a few months ago that shows advisors to Jeb compared to advisors to George, and take a look at this.
I mean, but this is a bigger issue in my view, Brian. This is about the issue of accountability in our politics, foreign policy. It's about the end of impunity in America. You see in that Venn diagram some of the very same people who took us into Iraq, who have created much of the chaos we're witnessing in the region, in the Middle East, and they're back. So it's about a Bush problem, but it's a larger, broader problem in our culture and society, I think.
I don't think the Venn diagram by itself is sufficient to deal with this issue because there are a lot of different people on that list who have different positions themselves. And the fact is, if you're a Democrat, you're going to rely on a lot of the people who were in office in the last Democratic administration. Same thing if you're a Republican. So the fact that he's relying on a lot of people who were in office when his brother was president isn't the problem. The issue is, does he have a different way of taking on the world than his brother did? And we haven't seen that. Somebody put it really well. They said the Republicans want to repudiate the Iraq War, but not the thinking that led to the Iraq War. But I think that's a very good point.
But it's a changed world, too, Gideon. I think you'd agree. It's changed since Bush 1, Bush W. Both of them were president. And I would agree with Gideon. It's about the field, the bench that each party has. And I see a problem with what Hillary Clinton might bring to the White House. I think my view in shorthand is that liberal internationalism has been hijacked by a kind of triumphalist interventionism, which meshes with neocon thinking sometimes. And in that, we need a new team, we need new thinking.
All right. Now stay with us for evidence-based politics. Time for evidence-based politics, where we meet a scholar who's actually studied an issue that's being oversimplified on the trail by campaign rhetoric. In the first Democratic debate, the candidates were asked by moderator Anderson Cooper, what is the greatest national security threat to the United States? Now, there is one surprising answer in this sequence. See if you can identify it.
It's certainly the chaos in the Middle East, there's no doubt about it.
Okay.
And it all started with the Iraq invasion.
Governor O'Malley?
I believe that nuclear Iran remains the biggest threat, along with the spread of ISIL. Climate change, of course, makes cascading threats even worse.
Secretary Clinton, the greatest national security threat?
I think it has to be continuing threat from the spread of nuclear weapons, nuclear material that can fall into the wrong hands. I know the terrorists are constantly seeking it, and that's why we have to stay vigilant, but also united around the world to prevent that.
Senator Sanders, greatest national security threat?
The scientific community is telling us if we do not address the global crisis of climate change, transform our energy system away from fossil fuel to sustainable energy, the planet that we're going to be leaving our kids and our grandchildren may well not be habitable. That is a major crisis.
Senator.
Which one does not belong? The one at the end that the audience liked the most. So are security and climate change actually connected? How and to what extent? Well, new research suggests that climate is a major factor in many of the world's wars. And joining us via Skype to discuss the research is Professor Edward Miguel, Director of the Center for Effective Global Action at the University of California. His study, Climate Conflict, was published by the National Bureau of Economic Research. Welcome, Professor Miguel. Hello from New York.
Thanks a lot. Great to be here.
I see you did a literature review of climate studies and military conflict. in the last decade, and you found a highly statistically significant pattern that areas experiencing unusual temperature and rainfall patterns were more likely to have war. Let me put up some of your stats right here. What you found is that in those climate-disrupted areas, interpersonal or local conflict went up 2%, intergroup conflict, like civil wars, went up 11%, and there's a chart reflecting that in the global tropics. How many places did that include, and where, these patterns?
We looked for all the evidence that was out there, and there were 55 studies that we found. There's data from Africa, India, Brazil on civil war, on land invasions, on rioting, and what was so striking about the relationship was how universal it was. So extreme climate in the form of very high temperatures, extreme rainfall, are associated with political instability, and as you mentioned, intergroup violence. So civil war in Africa is much more likely to occur after a drought. Hindu-Muslim rioting goes up in India when there's extreme climate, and land invasions go up in Brazil. And even in the U.S., when there's a hot month in a city, and I think people in New York, have kind of conventional wisdom on this, there's more violent crime. So it's a very wide-ranging relationship we identified.
How did you measure whether it might be a coincidence that the areas with the most global warming in the last decade also had the most conflict as opposed to causation?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that's a great question. And the statistical approach that we used didn't just compare, area A to area B. What we did is we took advantage of the fact that any given city or country has hotter years and cooler years. And most of the analysis is really comparing those hot and cool years. So you could look at Nigeria during a drought versus Nigeria during a period of better climatic conditions. And we find that when climatic conditions are bad in Nigeria, they're more prone to political violence. So we're not comparing Nigeria to the US or anything like that. And that makes the statistical inference more robust.
I've read an argument in another paper that Syria in particular, the conflict the world is most concerned with right now, already had a refugee crisis of more than 1 million people from unusual patterns of drought just before the Arab Spring uprising started. Did you review academic literature on that?
So when we did our review a couple years ago, there wasn't that data. That's a new crisis, so we don't have Arab Spring studies in our analysis, but I think you could think of the Arab Spring type outcomes, and especially Syria, as providing some further evidence that's consistent with what we found. So we made a prediction based on our data, based on all the existing evidence, that drought and extreme temperature leads to this kind of violence, and then Syria happened. So, any single country has, a conflict has multiple causes. Our analysis is statistical, so it's general. But Syria is certainly consistent with the idea of our research, yeah.
And what about the United States? If Bernie Sanders suggests in that soundbite that climate change is our #1 national security threat, are there data to back that up?
Well, certainly if you think of cases like Syria and Somalia and Sudan and Mali, and we can go on, places that have been hit with rising temperatures and drought in the last couple decades, the conflicts that ensued have ensnared the U.S. So we're not an island. When there are conflicts in other countries, it affects the U.S., given our geopolitical role. So I think there's something to what Bernie Sanders said. I don't know if I'd want to go out on a limb and say this is the #1 threat facing the U.S., but is it a very important threat? Definitely.
You did find in your socioeconomic comparison that the poorer the country, the more susceptible they are to conflict as a result of drought from climate change, correct?
That's exactly right. Poor countries hit with extreme shocks are much more likely to have widespread political violence and instability. We have a terrible drought right now in California, and we don't have that kind of outbreak of violence. We have stronger institutions, a stronger government, et cetera. But in poor societies, there are fewer resources to deal with those problems, and the descent into conflict and violence is much more rapid.
Katrina, you're writing yourself a note. Anything you want to ask Professor Miguel?
Professor Miguel, this is fascinating. I wanted to suggest, my understanding is that the Pentagon, in fact, has recognized climate change as one of the central, if not the central, security challenge to the United States in 2020. And if that's the case, why don't we hear more about that? And finally, maybe a question not for a great scientist thinker, but where's the political will to take action on some of what you have said in this wonderfully evidence-based way?
Well, thank you. You raise a good point there. The Defense Department is taking this seriously, and actually my research team and others who do this kind of research have been in touch with folks in the Defense Department. They're very aware of this. They're serious about it. In terms of the political will, I think that's harder to address. Of course, we have a huge fraction of people in our society who don't even think climate change is real. They kind of ignore all the science. And the scientific evidence is accumulating, not just on the warming, but on the implications of warming. My colleagues and I have a paper that came out today in the journal Nature showing very strong economic impacts of rising temperature as well. So there's political impacts, there's economic impacts. The science is accumulating. Hopefully over time the science will overcome the lack of political will. At least that's my hope.
Gideon, what do you want to add here?
Well, I think there's a weak version of the argument and a strong version. And I'm a lot more comfortable with the weak version, which is global warming leads to stress, and in countries that have weak institutions and low ability to deal with stress, it can exacerbate conflict. But I think the California example is a very apt one, which is there's not a direct link between the environmental stress and the conflict. The mediating factor is political institutions. We've known this ever since Sam Huntington back in the 60s. If good institutions enable you to deal with a variety of stresses, and poor institutions leave you vulnerable to being at the mercy of those stresses. And what the environmental change does is it increases the stresses, but whether or not a marriage will break up not just because of a stress, but because of the strength of the bonds holding the people together. A country will face instability and turmoil not just because of the absolute amount of the stressor, but about the institutional ability to adapt. We're not seeing wars in the streets in California because of the drought.
Professor, you're nodding your head.
That certainly is the case. I mean, what you see in rich countries at high temperatures in our research is rising violent crime and a smaller magnitude. I think Brian mentioned the magnitudes. You still see an increase in violence, but not this sort of breakdown in social order the way you see it in poor countries with weak institutions. There's no doubt about that.
So, and I have one last point, which is I think there can be two ways that Sanders was talking about global security being a threat. One is indirectly, i.e., global climate change leads to stress, leads to conflict, which then turns into an old-fashioned regular conflict. That's one route. I actually think that's a relatively minor route. The other way is a more direct route, which is global warming causes all sorts of dramatic problems. Cities get swamped, refugee crises occur, economic damage occurs. If indeed the pessimists are correct about the consequences that will flow from global warming, the direct economic, human, and environmental consequences, then we don't need to have the intermediating factor of, it's going to cause a war, which we'll get dragged into, and the war is important. We can just deal with the global climate issues themselves directly and say this. So my objection is more that we should consider climate change an important issue, but I don't see why we necessarily need to consider it a national security issue.
Katrina, do you think that when we get to the general election, this can break out as a real issue? I mean, even in the context of the Democratic debate, Bernie Sanders was kind of the outlier on national security when everybody else was saying Iran or Russian nukes and things like that. We will see almost certainly a Democratic nominee who takes global warming seriously and a Republican nominee who doesn't, who minimizes it.
Well, you heard Martin O'Malley take it seriously.
If they say that the Pentagon, like you've all been saying, look, the Pentagon already takes it seriously, does that change anything?
We have a tough road in this country, partly because of the media. The media still buys into sometimes the false equivalence where you give a climate denier as much time as someone like this very good professor. Thank you for giving him this time. But I think we are living in a movement moment, Brian, and I think that the climate movement is growing. We're heading into a Paris summit where I think there will be some real movement on emissions limits. Countries will show some will. And this is where you need a global compact. China, Russia. You need to bring in the poorer countries. I think it will be a big issue for many. It will not be the overriding issue. For Bernie Sanders, interestingly, it's also a corporate issue, which links to his politics. This story the other day, and I hope the professor will correct me, but about ExxonMobil failing to reveal what it has known about climate science is one that has now launched, Bernie Sanders and other senators launched an investigation into these companies which are raking it in and also wreaking havoc. But there needs to be a transition plan, and there are good green jobs plans galore. It's political will, Brian.
Professor, I'll give you the last word in our last 20 seconds or so. What's the next study? You're always looking for further research when you're an academic.
Right. I mean, I think the comment that was made about broader impacts even beyond conflict is right. I mean, our new research is showing and others showing huge economic implications even for the U.S. of climate change, U.S. agriculture, U.S. labor productivity. So even if there isn't an outbreak of rioting and violence in California due to climate change, the economy is going to be affected. We have to take this seriously. It's real on many fronts.
The Canadian wine industry is doing great.
Because it's warming there?
Well, wait a minute. The new Canadian government is going to take climate change much more seriously than the previous
Maybe
one.
they'd be better off in Canada. Why would they want to fight warming in a place like Canada?
You sound like Marco Rubio on steroids. Sorry.
That was a joke. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you both very much. And Professor, thank you very much for joining us from Berkeley. And that's it for this week's edition of POTUS 2016. We're here each week at this hour covering the horse race and throwing cold, hard facts against the overheated campaign rhetoric. I'm Brian Lehrer. Thanks for watching.